technicians that are aiming it and pulling the trigger. And that stuff's landing. I say pulling the trigger. It's a control board these days. And that stuff is landing inside Russia.
Well, this is the whole point. All these steps increase the risk of direct confrontation. This is the insane game that this administration is playing. Beyond using Ukraine in a way that sacrifices itself and its people, its long-term future, playing with the risk of what Joe Biden called Armageddon. Recall that Joe Biden at a private fundraiser at one of the Murdoch sons' house in the Upper East Side of Manhattan said that this is the closest we've been to Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said this over a year ago. And the Biden administration policy has been rather to mitigate the risk of Armageddon to continue to fuel it. And this is another example of that. Recall also that Lloyd Austin is the same guy who just over a year ago went before Congress, where he's supposed to be under oath and telling the truth, and said that Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive has a very good chance of success. When Lloyd Austin knew, as Pentagon leaks confirmed, that at best, U.S. intelligence officials had assessed that Ukraine had, at best, a modest chance of success because they recognized the obvious. And it goes back to what we were talking about before. Ukraine doesn't have air power, unlike Russia. So therefore, Ukraine's at a huge military disadvantage. So Pentagon planners know that whatever they do, Russia will have the military advantage. But because the overriding policy is not to defend Ukraine, but just to bleed Russia, it's full steam ahead with the same dangerous escalatory policies.
Does the West understand Putin's mentality? Do they understand that he doesn't bluff?
That's a great question. That is a wonderful. I'd love to know the answer to that. You'd think professionals would understand by now that Putin has not bluffed and that Putin has backed up his red lines with force. The fact that he invaded Ukraine was the clearest sign that he was not going to let Ukraine be used as a U.S. proxy. He was not going to let Ukraine be used as a place where they build up CIA bases and train forces and side with ultranationalists. But if you look at the policy so far coming out of Washington, it's not clear that they know that. So it's a great question. I'd love to know the answer from them directly.
Is hatred of Putin or fear of Russia or a wish to divide Russia a precondition for joining NATO?
I certainly think it's a huge driving factor. I mean, NATO's supposed to be a military alliance, a defensive military alliance. But yet, when Russia tried to join, both Yeltsin and Putin raised the issue. They were told very quickly, no, that's not going to happen. And the reasons why is very clear why, because NATO is a tool of U.S. hegemony, and hegemony always needs an enemy. And Russia plays that role very, very well. There's just no way they were going to let Russia be integrated into a inclusive European security order. And so, yes, I do think being willing to play along with that is a condition for membership, and being willing to accordingly hand over parts of your economy to the military-industrial complex is another condition. And that's why the U.S. is so big on everyone spending at least 2% of their GDP, so much of which goes to U.S. arms merchants to purchase their weapons of war.
Is there, going back to where we started about the instability of the government, have your sources revealed, I'm going to guess no, or you would have told us, but you tell us what you can, any indications that a regime change might happen in Ukraine, since there was no election and he can't extend his own term legally, and under the law his term ended 2 days ago?
If I'm making a prediction, I don't think Zelensky will be overthrown from within, even though there's a lot of bitterness towards him, a lot of resentment. There's obviously huge corruption. There's people who don't like how authoritarian he's become. I mean, recall, he shut down political opposition and opposition media, not just after Russia's invasion, but even 1 year before, which I think was a major factor in Russia ultimately deciding to invade, when Zelensky went after allies of Russia, or at least people who were sympathetic to Russia and wanted to reach a peace deal with Russia rather than have the war in the Donbass. But the reason why I think Zelensky will stick around is as long as the U.S. deems him to be useful, I think that's all he needs to stay around. And clearly they've put a lot of capital in him, and he has done U.S. bidding so far. Occasionally, he annoys the Biden administration when he gets out of line. So, for example, at the NATO summit last year, when he complained that Ukraine was given a empty promise about joining NATO, he was upset about that. But he was told to shut his mouth, and he did. And he ended up, thanking his U.S. patrons for all their generous support. So, as long as he has the support of Washington, I think we'll see Zelensky around, because the irony of Ukraine is that for all this talk about wanting to be an independent country, have democracy, stand up to Russian influence, is they've been completely subsumed by U.S. influence. And, I've spoken to a former Ukrainian official about this, Andrei Telachenko, who would tell me he was working inside the Ukrainian government after the coup. And he would talk about how Ukrainian officials would get U.S. counterparts to sign off on hiring decisions, on who to hire, who to fire. And of course, the most famous example of this is Joe Biden saying you have to fire that prosecutor, or else we're not giving you this loan. And of course, they complied.
And they complied. I'm going to guess that Mrs. Newland enjoyed making those decisions. Getting back to your article with the tantalizing title about desperation leads to escalation, what kind of escalation do you think they're going to try? How deep into Russia are they going to go? I mean, do we even know if they caused the slaughter at the Crocus concert hall? Is it asymmetrical warfare, or is it reaching into Russia with American weaponry to attack Russian military bases, which would be a legal target for them?
Well, they've already been hitting Belgorod, and they've hit civilian sites there, not military sites. They've killed civilians there, and I expect more of that. I expect more attacks on Crimea.
Yeah, let me just stop you. This is Belgorod. This is tape from Patrick Lancaster, the American freelance journalist who's there, who will be on with us at 9:00 tomorrow morning Eastern time. But in anticipation of that, he sent this to us.
Yeah, so there we go. Those are the kind of targets that Ukraine has been hitting. So I would expect more of that. I'd expect more attacks on Crimea, which certainly Ukraine can reach now with these ATACMS. I believe the range of these long-range ATACMS is 400 miles. So Ukraine will certainly be going after Crimea even more, I think, with these weapons.
I assume, in light of that clip we saw from Secretary Austin and to whom he was speaking, that American military officials either approve or are consulted before these projectiles reach into Russia.
The Washington Post had a report over a year ago saying that basically before any strike by Ukraine with U.S. weapons, the U.S. is involved. So basically the U.S. is helping with targeting and approving all these strikes. So absolutely. And people like Victoria Nuland have made very clear that Crimea is fair game. Crimea was a part of Ukraine, but of course, before it was part of Ukraine, it was a part of the Russian political sphere before it was transferred under the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And of course, according to U.S.-backed polls, the vast majority of Crimeans want to be a part of Russia. But all that gets ignored because there's so much bitterness against Russia for taking Crimea after the U.S.-backed coup. And so therefore, after blockading Crimea for years, cutting off its water supply, now they'll be using even more U.S. weaponry to hit it.
Nuland and her buddies inside the State Department and out are really crazy. Under the laws of war, Putin could attack the United States, knowing that American generals have orchestrated attacks on Russia using American military equipment, whether the button was pressed by a Polish official or a Ukrainian official or an American official. They know that the Americans have orchestrated attacks inside Russia. They can attack. I don't want this to happen at all, but they can attack inside the United States. Putin's not stupid enough to do that. But the Americans and the Tory Nuland mentality are crazy enough to bring that about.
It's the dangerous game we're playing. Early in Russia's invasion, U.S. officials and the New York Times took credit for attacks that were killing Russian generals. They took credit. They were boasting about it. And yeah, I agree with you. I don't think Russia is going to attack the U.S. in response. But the question becomes, why are we even risking it? And what kind of risk does this create in other areas of direct conflict, say, I don't know, inside Ukraine or around there, or in Syria, where you have both U.S. and Russian forces? There's so many risks we're taking just with this policy. And how would we react if Russian generals were bragging about facilitating attacks that were killing U.S. generals. It's a very dangerous game we're playing.
Here's a ghost out of the past. The former director of the CIA, who's also a former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, warning how strong the Russians now are. Cut number 4, Chris.
Putin has taken the last 6 months to a year to rearm, re-equip, to recruit. I've read numbers that he's putting as many as 30,000 new troops a month into Ukraine. They have more troops in Ukraine now, the Russians do, than they did at the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. So I think the real issue now is how fast can we get the equipment that the Ukrainians need into the field, into their hands, beginning with air defense, but also artillery and rocket and missiles. And so I hope that there is a sense of huge urgency in the Pentagon and elsewhere about getting this equipment into the hands of the Ukrainians literally within the next few weeks.
They have to be trained how to use it, or they have to be American trainers on the ground. What country has troops on the ground in Ukraine? What Western countries?
Well, according to that leaked German audio of those German military leaders discussing how they could circumvent their elected chancellor, right, Olaf Scholz, and send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. There were Americans and French troops and Brits there helping to operate these weapon systems. That's just the danger. That's another part of the dangerous game we're playing, having our forces there taking direct part in these attacks. And of course, the Germans said that the Americans were dressed in civilian clothes, but I don't think that's fooling anybody. I think Russia understands that they're there as well. But, Gates' comments about how Russia has more forces now inside Ukraine than ever before, how it's rebuilt its military. Compare his assessment to what we were hearing just a few months ago when the Biden administration was begging Congress for another $61 billion, which they eventually got. Back then, anonymous U.S. intelligence officials were telling Congress that Russia's lost 90% of its army in Ukraine. 90%. And the reason they were doing that now is very clear. It was clear at the time, but it's especially clear now. They were desperate to get this money from Congress. So they're trying to sell them on why this is a good investment. They were trying to lie and say, look, we've already killed so many Russians. We just need a little bit more money to kill the last 10%. But now all of a sudden, we have to admit the truth that actually Russia is stronger militarily than ever before.
That is a great point, Aaron. And what these people told the Congress is called fraud. It's a crime, a material misrepresentation made in order to induce the other person to rely on it to their detriment. Oh, but when it's other people's money, when it's the taxpayers' money or money borrowed in their name or printed by the Federal Reserve, they don't care. Aaron, thank you very much for your great research and your great presentation on all of this, my dear friend. We have to get together in that hole in the wall on the Lower East Side again if we can get the Max and Anya to join us. But thanks very much, my friend. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Judge. Likewise.